Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and today we're going to have a look at the different settings in Flight Sim that you can change to improve the feel of the in-game experience and bring a bit more challenge and realism to your flying. Today's focus will be on the General and Assistances menu, and we're going to skip the graphics and the controls because those are entire topics unto themselves, and I'll make more videos on those specifically in the future if there's interest. We won't go over absolutely every setting either because that would take forever, and we'll look at only the most important things that you should know about. So let's go straight into the language tab then. The first setting that I turn off here is subtitles, and there's two reasons for it, but the first one is that it takes up space on screen, and they remove the immersion of flying along and having to listen to what's being said as well. The other reason to turn the subtitles off is if you're using external ATC, because that means the in-game subtitles won't be relevant to you, and there are a few other options with regards to that we'll look at in just a bit. Strangely, there are two places to disable subtitles. There's one here and another one over on the accessibility menu, and I'm not quite sure what the difference between the two is, but I have them both disabled regardless. If we go back to where we were on the General tab under Language, the units of measurement is an interesting one because from what I've seen, it only affects the numbers that you see in the menu, so like the airplane selection screen or even in career mode when you're selecting a mission. It doesn't affect any of the plane systems. That's still configured on a per plane basis, so for that reason I just end up leaving this as US system. What I will do on the other hand when I'm doing a flight is configure the plane to use the correct units based on where I'm flying, but that involves digging through the plane's avionics to switch it over. There are also a bunch of units of measurement settings within the built-in tablet that can be changed independently from the menu options that we were just looking at. It's kind of a similar story with payware add-ons as well. They'll often let you configure the units that you're using with their own tooling inside the airplane. Let's move over to sound now, where there are a few important settings to keep an eye out for. First off, make sure that you have headphone simulation disabled, especially if you're flying add-on planes, which have custom sound sets, and they may not work properly with it enabled, and you won't get their full experience. For the same reason, the next big one to make sure is disabled is the loudness limiter so that you get the full authentic experience of the sounds, because when it comes to custom sound sets in third-party airplanes, there are definitely going to be issues with this left on. For the volume levels, I've turned the character voices down to 0, again because I use Beyond ATC, which has its own voices that you'll want to hear instead. I've also turned the menu music down just because it gets repetitive after a while, but that's more of a personal preference than anything else. Okay, so on the online tab, photogrammetry is what makes the world look as good as it does, so you want that to stay on, but it does occasionally get turned off automatically when there are network or server issues. If that happens to you, it doesn't actually turn itself back on once the issues are resolved, so if the world is looking radically different than it normally does, it's worth coming back to check if this is still on. I have the traffic settings turned off here since I'm using Beyond ATC to inject traffic instead, but also keep in mind that more traffic here means more CPU and GPU cycles to manage it, so there is a performance cost to having this on. For multiplayer settings, I tend to leave it disabled unless I'm specifically going to fly with a friend online, just because I rather have the injected traffic from Beyond ATC instead. Replication models can also affect performance, so if you're someone who does a lot of big group multiplayer flights, you might want to switch this to simplified because the high fidelity models can put quite the load on your PC. All of the communication options that you see right here, I believe are for a feature that we don't have access to because I've never seen it in action anywhere, so we won't worry about that and we'll jump straight to the rolling cache. A cache is a high-speed way to store and access data that you're going to need frequently, and the way that the rolling cache works in Flight Sim is that as you fly around, the scenery objects and the textures get loaded into the cache. That means if you fly around in the same area frequently, those objects will stay in the cache for longer, meaning that you won't need to re-download them again since they're already available locally. That's where the rolling aspect of it comes into play. It refers to how it evicts objects in the cache by taking older objects that haven't been used in a while to make place for newer objects as you continue to fly around. Now, I've seen a lot of differing advice about if you should make your rolling cache big or small, or even if you should consider deleting it when you change regions, or even when there's a sim update. My take on this is that there are no right or wrong answers, especially since there's been no official advice from Microsoft or Asobo on what the ideal settings are for it. So unless you're actually having problems, I wouldn't worry about it at all. One common suggestion that I've seen is if you're having stuttering or similar issues, to delete the cache and see if that helps. I think it's unlikely to be a silver bullet to fixing your problems though, but if you want to give it a go, there are plenty of guides online as to how to go about the exact steps of that. We'll go over to camera tab now, although this is one place where I haven't customized all that much since I don't really use the default camera modes. Instead, I rely on my own custom views and bindings to move around the cockpit. I've covered how I set that up in the past, so I won't go over it again here, but I'll make sure to leave a link below so that you can check it out if you're interested. The only other setting that I want to point out here is the camera shake option, which I prefer to keep off, but if you're looking for more of a cinematic feel to your flight sim, it can definitely help you out in that regard. Alright, over on the flight model tab, you always want to keep this set to modern unless there's a payware developer that specifically tells you to switch it back to legacy for their plane. I actually haven't seen anyone ask for that setting to be changed since 2024 released, and it really seems like third-party developers have embraced the modern flight model. As for the flight interface options, I've got all of the settings off here, which helps to make the world look more natural since there won't be all sorts of pins and visualizations on screen. The only time the markers can be useful to turn back on is if you're doing a mission that requires you to overfly a specific point of interest, but otherwise I just keep them all off. The nameplates option is really for when you're doing multiplayer, and it shows a nameplate with the gamer tag of other people in the area, and it makes it really easy to keep track of where your friends are as you're flying along together. The other important setting that I've changed here is the cockpit interactions, which has two options, legacy and lock, and by default it's set to lock. When you hover over an item with the lock option enabled, it'll highlight it and give you basically a universal way to interact with all of the controls in the cockpit, and it really gives you the feel that it's optimized for a game controller. Personally, I find the lock interactions too intrusive, which is why I have it set to legacy, since it gives you a much cleaner look to the controls. On the assistances page, I've got almost everything turned off, which isn't because I've been flight simming forever, it's also that a lot of these assistances actually make it harder to control the plane even for beginners. Things like auto trim and auto rudder especially can seem beneficial when you're just starting out, but once you have a basic idea of how they work with the tutorials, it's really best to turn them off and get used to flying without them. The only one that I've left on here is the gyro drift, which will only affect certain planes anyways, like the A2A Comanche, but I don't find that it removes much from the realism anyways. I've got all the visual assistances off, like the flight path, taxi ribbon, and waypoint markers, because you can do all of those things better yourself with the plane's built-in tools. And to be honest, those assistances can often lead you to do things that don't make sense either. In the realism settings, I have all the crash damage options disabled because they can cause problems with payware planes, on top of inadvertently triggering the flight to restart randomly with the back on track feature. Having all of these disabled effectively stops back on track from working, so if you crash, the flight doesn't end automatically like it would otherwise. For the turbulence setting, it can be pretty violent with smaller GA planes on the realistic setting, so in those situations it's not a bad idea to turn it down a notch, but for airliner flying, I just leave it on realistic. I've got the AI ATC and the flight plan settings turned off as well, because just like before, this is only for the built-in ATC, which I don't feel is worth it in its current state. I hope these settings and the links that I've left throughout the video will help you get more from Flight Sim, and if you learned something useful today, please make sure to like the video and subscribe on your way out.